It's not the way they meant to release it, but a draft of the Labour manifesto has found its way into the press tonight. 43 pages of it. A radical manifesto, but is it 1983 all over again? The Mirror journalist Jack Blanchard, with his own leaked copy, joins us. Also tonight,
Jamie, you're fired. And you know how much I like you.
is he trying to run the US like it's a game show? We'll ask if the president is irreversibly politicising American justice by sacking the director of the FBI. And Noam Chomsky, who hasn't mellowed much, aged 88. You've called the Republican Party the most dangerous organisation on earth.
In human history.
And this.
It's time to restrict UK housing to UK taxpayers.
Our latest Views Night. Hello, probably not the news that Labour wanted, but a draft of their manifesto has been leaked. The Telegraph and Daily Mirror have it and wrote it up about 90 minutes ago. Now, Labour's National Executive Committee is gathering tomorrow in what's called a Clause 5 meeting to agree the final version. So it could, in theory, all be changed. And Labour tonight told us, we do not comment on leaks. We will announce our policies in our manifesto, which is our plan to transform Britain for the many, not the few. Well, many, not the few, is the kind of theme of the draft, with, for example, a plan for there to be at least one publicly owned energy company in every part of the UK. National Grid, railways and bus companies are to be nationalised. Well, I'm joined by Jack Blanchard, the Mirror's political editor, replete with a copy of the thing, and our own political editor, Nick Watt. So, just to be clear, Jack, what you've got there is a printout. It's not actually a sort of typeset, formalised version of the thing.
No, I'm afraid not. There's no cover, there's no glossy feel to it. It's very much a sort of dodgy leaked Word document, but it does have all 43 pages of measures in it, or at least the draft measures that they're yet to agree.
And among those measures, give us some of the eye-catching ones.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in there. I mean, I've spent most of the afternoon reading through it, and as you mentioned, there's this plan to bring the energy industry, or big parts of the energy industry, back into public ownership. There's a huge investment plan for the NHS, £6 billion extra a year, which will be funded by new taxes for people earning more than £80,000 a year. There's 100,000 council houses to be built every year. Tuition fees
every year,
yeah, council houses and housing association homes.
Yeah.
Tuition fees abolished entirely.
Right,
which
we kind of knew that anyway.
Yeah, there was a sort of speech this afternoon where that was flicked at. And then creation of new Whitehall departments, a Ministry of Labour, a Department for Housing, because Labour see workers' rights and housing is absolutely central to what they're all about. New homes for rough sleepers, lots and lots on workers' rights.
Right, Nick, the Telegraph have written it up tonight, obviously, taking a slightly different spin than the Daily Mirror. They're saying this is, 1983 all over again.
Yeah, what's interesting is that the moderates in the Labour Party are relatively relaxed about this draft manifesto, which they had obviously seen. What they're saying is this is the closest that the Labour Party really has got to the 1980s, the famous, as you said, 1983 manifesto, the longest suicide note in history, as the late Sir Gerald Corferman called it, but they're saying it is actually still not that document. There is, in this draft of this manifesto, upholding Labour's commitment to renewing Trident, although they then say there's a rather curious paragraph after that where it says that any Prime Minister would want to use the nuclear deterrent with caution, to which they say, well, I think they have adopted caution because they're not aware that it's been used up until now. Interestingly, 2% a commitment to that NATO 2% spending on defence. Jeremy Corbyn, in his heart of hearts, doesn't believe in those two things. And interestingly, banning arms sales to Yemen, they're saying Robin Cook could have written that in 1997.
Right. What? Does this? Who's written this? Is this Corbyn's team writing this, or does it?
No, it is absolutely.
So,
yeah, it's two or three key members in Jeremy Corbyn's team who've sat down. They've obviously haven't had very much time to do it. I think the starting point actually was the 2015 manifesto that Ed Miliband. That was because you have 2 weeks to do this, and then they started looking at all the other things that they want to do, and they've sort of reached out from there.
It's sometimes said Labour are not doing very well in the polls, but when you look at the individual policies, like nationalising the railways, people all say yes, we want a bit more of that. I mean, Some of this, would you even describe it as quite populist in flavour? You know, taxing the rich a lot more to pay for more money in the NHS. I mean, some of it, we want a choice of a nationalised company in every region of the country for your energy. Is that populism?
It's interesting. I spoke to a senior member of Corbyn's team tonight to let them know that we had this, that we're going to be running it. Did they want to say anything? They didn't want to comment on the record. But what they did say is that the point they made was when I said some of this looks quite left-wing, and they said, well, no, what this is popular. If you look at these individual policies about how people feel about energy, about privatised railways, about higher taxes for rich people, on each individual one, people agree with them on that.
And it was interesting, I was talking to one moderate this afternoon, for example, in that it's going to be abolition of university tuition fees. This moderate said that's absolutely tremendous, that will completely connect. People will like that, people will understand that. And interestingly, this moderate said, oh dear me, is this going to raise questions about their strategy? Their strategy on this manifesto
the moderate strategy.
Yeah, the moderate strategy is let Jeremy Corbyn own it. The one red line, to coin a phrase, was you've got to have the Trident renewal commitment, but everything else, they're taking the strategy adopted by John Golding, known as the hammer of the left at that 1983 manifesto, and he said the left must own this so then they can own the general election result.
Right. Let's just think a bit about the process. So firstly, this goes tomorrow to this Clause 5 meeting. Is that just a formality normally? Is that going to just nod it through, or are they going to take a pen and the whole, however many, 20 of them on the NEC be kind of over each other's shoulders trying to...
I think it's more generally it's more tweaks rather than anything more serious than that. You might see the odd thing change, the odd wording change. It would be unusual for them to try and rewrite the manifesto. I mean, they're launching it next week.
Yeah.
In the past, you had battles, although the battles would take place beforehand. But remember, it's not just the NEC, it's the shadow cabinet, and it is the trade union liaison and organisation contact group. So the trade unions do have a big say. I was told the one thing that might cause problem at that meeting tomorrow is what this draft manifesto says about immigration. The trade unions, I understand it, don't think it goes far enough in making clear that there will be some sorts of limits on it, because we all know that Jeremy Corbyn is very much in favour of immigration.
Will the party be really annoyed? I mean, is it a shambles? Or is this a clever media strategy that they have thought, let's leak it out, we'll get attention, we'll get people talking, we'll...
It's not that. I mean, I think it's a bit hard. It looks slightly shambolic. My understanding is that this has happened before. Because Labour has this process where they have this big meeting full of senior people who all sit down together and discuss it, you know, leaks,
they've all had it,
leaks
basically.
can happen because of that process, but it's in Labour's constitution and that's how they work. No, it's not what they planned, but in the end, you know, a lot of this stuff was due to come out next week anyway, so I don't think it's the end of the world.
Nick, I mean, obviously, Jack couldn't possibly talk about this, but Nick, whose interest is it to leak this, and for what motive?
Well, I mean, you know, it's the Metternich Talleyrand point. You know, what did he mean by dying? You could say that the Corbynites have a good reason for leaking it to sort of get away with any problems, but also you could say
to stop anybody watering it down.
Exactly.
In the meeting
and you
tomorrow.
could argue that people on the moderate would want to show, look, this is what the country is facing. But I mean, you can play that game. It wasn't leaked to me, so I don't exactly know where it came.
And we won't ask Jack. Look, thanks for coming in, Jack, with it, and Nick, thanks very much. So, a president fires the head of the Internal Security Service on perplexing grounds that are months old, just as that security service is investigating the president's own campaign team. Doesn't sound like the US, but it is. Today, the New York Times reported that the terminated director of the FBI, James Comey, had just been asking for more resources for his investigation into Russian connections to the Trump campaign. Was he sacked to thwart an inconvenient investigation, or do we believe the Trump line that Mr. Comey had lost the trust of Democrats and Republicans alike, and the FBI needed a fresh start? Well, for many, the president has crossed a dangerous threshold. The Constitution has checks and balances on his power, but it has to allow him some discretion, and to them, he's broken the spirit of US convention by exploiting his powers to an entirely self-interested end. Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is with me. I mean, Mark, in sort of FBI terms, history of the FBI, how big a deal is it for a director to be sacked?
I think, like a good barrister, you know the answer to this question, Evan. One has been sacked before, and he was sacked by Bill Clinton back in '93, William Sessions. People said, oh, this was a Nixonian move. Well, Nixon fired the special prosecutor who had been appointed to investigate the Watergate burglary. So that's where there are parallels. I mean, consternation in Washington today, and all sorts of versions coming out of a beleaguered president who hadn't been out for days, becoming obsessed with this Russia issue, looking for a pretext, not telling anyone, finally boiling over and doing it. Now, of course, that's from anti-Trump media, but a couple of interesting circumstantial signs. It's true he hadn't been doing public engagements in recent days, and it's also true that even his press people seemed unaware until moments before this happened that it was going to happen. They've been putting out some other lines today on background like, oh, we thought the Democrats would really like this and be supportive because of the whole Hillary Clinton saga. Look, the key to this is everybody has jumped to their own conclusion about why it happened, and that's largely to do with the Russia thing. But of course, that Russia investigation will go on.
Yeah. Well, as Mark says, it all comes back to the investigation of connections between the Trump campaign and the Russians. No one has produced evidence of it yet, but there is a lurking suspicion or allegation that Team Trump might have encouraged, coordinated, or been in some way complicit with Russian hacking of the Clinton team's emails. If that was true, well, let's just say it's not a good thing to do. Paul Wood is in Washington and looks at what's left of the investigations into the Russian connection to the Trump campaign.
The political melodrama House of Trump is a ratings smash, but at times it's a little dark. And the plot does stretch credulity. In part one, the FBI investigates whether the Trump campaign conspired with a foreign power, Russia, to steal the US presidential election. In part two, Trump fires the FBI director James Comey. The audience is left to wonder why.
Everybody knows Dr. Kissinger.
It wasn't to derail the FBI investigation, the president insists. And yes, that is Henry Kissinger next to him. The questions, naturally, were about Comey's sacking.
Because he wasn't doing a good job, very simply. He was not doing a good job.
The president wrote a terse letter to Comey, saying it was vital to restore public trust and confidence in the FBI. Significantly, he recalled Comey informing me on 3 separate occasions that I am not under investigation. At the White House briefing, an avalanche of skepticism.
Look, I think it was something that far above my pay grade was decided to be included. And again, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. Thanks, guys, so much.
Trump's critics paint a different picture. They don't believe Comey was sacked, as the White House says, because he was too tough on Hillary Clinton. The White House should perhaps recall what another president, LBJ, said about another FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover. Better to have him inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in. It is a delicious irony that Russia's foreign minister should be visiting Washington today to see Mr. Trump.
You're kidding. You're kidding.
Such insouciance is impressive. Never forget that the US intelligence agencies all say that Russia did interfere in the election and that they did it to put President Trump in office.
Raise your right hand, please.
That assessment was made by James Clapper when he was Director of National Intelligence. He told Congress this week that Russia had hacked leading Democrats and then leaked out damaging information in a sophisticated propaganda campaign.
They must be congratulating themselves for having exceeded their wildest expectations with a minimal expenditure of resource. And I believe they are now emboldened to continue such activities in the future, both here and around the world, and to do so even more intensely.
No evidence has been made public proving that the Trump campaign did conspire with Russia. Nothing. There's no evidence either for the claim that the Kremlin is blackmailing the president using a tape of him with prostitutes in Moscow. Nor has it yet been shown that Trump's business dealings put him in hock to the Russians. But the FBI investigation will continue after Comey's departure. There are also 4 separate congressional inquiries. All these investigations now have many more questions following the events of the past 24 hours. Why was Comey sacked? What does he know that's yet to be made public? And was Trump reassured that he himself was not the subject of an investigation. Washington echoes to talk that a special prosecutor might be appointed. Inevitably, the president's critics compare this to Watergate.
There is a clear and present danger of a cover-up. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And this firing has very much the look and feel of an effort to stop or stymie an investigation and politically interfere with it.
It's true. Not since Watergate has a president dismissed the person leading an investigation bearing on him. But President Trump may be right that only his aides and associates are being targeted now. Then the question will be that which came to define Watergate. What did the president know, and when did he know it?
Paul Wood there. Well, Mark Urban is still with me. Mark, how much of a danger do you think this Russia investigation is to President Trump?
Well, look, we know the idea that mesmerises the intelligence community, ex-Director Comey and others, as well as the president's political opponents. It is that there is some kind of connectivity that is provable between the Trump campaign and the hacking and leaking of emails during last year's presidential election. That is clearly the main thing they're going for. There are all sorts of other peripheral issues to do with money, possible meetings, coordinating policy, all these other things. But that's, I think, the central thing they want to prove. Now, clearly, if they get there, if it is possible to prove that connection of people meeting, of maybe money going, or actual connectivity. Oh yes, let's leak this one in the coming days. Then it's an absolute major bombshell. But they're a long way off, and the president's defences are still holding up in certain respects. So today, for example, more than 75 Democrats and independents joined the call for the appointment of a special prosecutor. No Republicans, just 3 Republicans in the Congress and the Senate, led by the indomitable John McCain, backed the idea of a special committee of inquiry. So on the Hill, his defences are holding up. Self-evidently, they haven't got to the point where they could launch a charge against individuals on these very serious potential allegations. And of course, even if they do, they may well be arm's-length associates, people who were dismissed from the campaign at some point during the campaign. And it may be, if there is, in the end, a parallel to Watergate, the attempts to cover up or disrupt investigations that could finally do for him.
Mark, thank you. Well, one concern is whether the president is somehow undermining the institutions of the US, politicising justice and damaging morale of the FBI and potentially the Department of Justice too. The kind of thing that you might expect of lesser countries. We're going to talk to Sidney Blumenthal, a senior aide to Bill Clinton, who worked at the Clinton Foundation. But first, to Charlotte Laws, an author and political commentator who was one of President Trump's earliest supporters. Charlotte Laws, why do you think the president acted now on this? This question of why now seems to be the one that has had least satisfactory answers.
Well, I think that it was a cumulative effect. I think it had been building like a storm for President Trump, and this goes all the way back to January. Comey had been increasingly viewed as a political figure, which is inappropriate for someone who's the director of the FBI. There had been calls from Republicans to sack him. I know here in Los Angeles, I'm an independent, but I know a lot of Republicans, and they were all saying to me all the way back in January, why doesn't Trump fire Comey? So there was this big push for that. And I'm sure Trump had that in his ear, just like I had it in my ear. The Democrats were calling for Comey to be fired during the campaign. You have reports that within the FBI, there was disgruntlement, that they were unhappy with the leadership. So that was happening at the same time. You have the controversy from a few days ago where Comey went out and misstated information regarding the emails and Huma Abedin, which created a huge controversy, and he had to come out and change what he had said and clarify it. And then you have the deputy AG who made a recommendation that he be fired. Right. So all of these things had come together, and I think Trump just had an erosion of confidence with respect to Comey.
You've given me a big list there, and you know, people will judge whether they think those things on that list are convincing or not. Do you not think the president should have thought about how it looks? He's being investigated, or his campaign is investigated by the FBI. He sacks the director. Maybe he should have said, I don't like this guy, but I'm going to wait till the investigation is over before I sack him.
Well, I think you don't do something like this unless you have a pure heart. So it's kind of like if your detractors, your enemies say, you stole a red Corvette, you don't go out and borrow a red Corvette, stick it in your driveway and flaunt it if you don't have a pure heart. And I think that his detractors would have criticized him no matter when he fired Comey. First of all, the investigation may not be over for years. And second of all, if he had done it back in January when he first came into office, he still would have been criticized for the same basic reasons.
Right.
So I think that so many people are anti-Trump in the media and the Democrats and the political figures that it's very hard for him to do anything that's seen as right or proper.
Right. Look, I want to ask you one question, because this one perplexes me. In the letter Trump sent Comey, he used this line, "While I greatly appreciate you informing me on 3 separate occasions that I am not under investigation, blah, blah, blah." Now, what a strange thing to write. It's as though on Trump's mind, as he's terminating this guy, on his mind is the investigation into his team. And why would you write that in there? It's very strange to me.
Because being president is very much public relations, and he wants to make it clear to America that he is not personally under investigation. And as I understand, he's not under investigation personally. So he wants to make that clear. And I also think the reason why he didn't call Comey himself is because Trump has a reputation of not liking to confront people and make them feel bad. It's very hard for him to fire people. In fact, I've heard many, many people say this with regards to the Trump organization, that he would leave people in the company even though he wanted them to go because he just couldn't bring himself to fire them face to face, or he would get someone else to do it. So I think that's probably the reason why he didn't call him, and that's the reason for that comment in the letter.
I mean, obviously his catchphrase was "you're fired," but ironically you're saying he was incapable of firing people. Charlotte, stay there, because I'm going to go to Sidney Blumenthal now, if I may, and I might come back to you afterwards. Mr. Blumenthal, do you think this is a sort of constitutional crisis, or at least a constitutional moment?
It's certainly a crisis of democracy, and it has been ever since the moment that Donald Trump was inaugurated. He's declared war on a free press. He's called them enemies of the people. There hasn't been that kind of language since Middle Europe in the 1930s against a free press. And he's attacked judges. He's called them so-called judges. He's attacked the judicial system on cases. He's involved in a case attempting to ban people based on their religion from the country.
Mr. Blumenthal, we know all of that. We know all of that. I'm just wondering whether that really undermines the institutions of democracy in the US, or whether it's
enormous
just talk.
stress on those institutions. There has not been a president like Donald Trump in the entire history of the United States. Not even Nixon. While Nixon was guilty of crimes, which were the articles of impeachment, there has not been such a systematic assault on the institutions of democracy in the United States than under Donald Trump.
You yourself and many Democrats, and we heard it from Charlotte earlier, basically blamed Comey for losing Hillary Clinton the election. So it's interesting that the Democrats are now the great defenders of Comey, because Comey's now Trump's enemy, so they have to come round and rally around him. What's going on there?
Well, I would say that the proximate cause given for the firing of Comey by the Assistant Attorney General was ridiculous on its face. It's entirely true that Comey is guilty of everything that's listed there and how he behaved. That happened back in July of 2016. After that event, Donald Trump conducted a very public campaign claiming that even though Hillary Clinton had been exonerated, that she should be locked up and that she was a criminal. He even used the Republican convention to express that theme. Mike Flynn led chants of lock her up from the platform of the Republican convention. So this is just ridiculous. Everyone knows this is a ridiculous reason. The reason is that he is attempting to obstruct the investigation into Russia's intervention in the U.S. election.
I mean, that's your charge, you know, and that the investigation or some congressional investigations will continue. But just tell me this, what are you meant to do if you're the President of the United States and you don't like your FBI director, and you don't think he's doing a good job, and there's chatter all over the place saying, look, the guy's not up to it. What are you meant to do? You're going to sack him, right?
Well, that's an interesting question. And had he wanted to change his FBI director, who has a term of 9 years, by the way, he could have done that when during his transition or when he first came into office. Instead, he praised him, and he had a public meeting with him that was filmed, in which he embraced him. So something else has happened. And what we've learned in the last 24 hours is that there's a grand jury that's been convened by James Comey, and that it is hearing testimony from associates of Michael Flynn, whose attorney says he has a story to tell. We've learned that James Comey had asked for a vast increase in funding for his investigation. So there are other elements involved here.
Yeah. Sidney Blumenthal, thanks. Let me briefly go back to you, Charlotte. You've heard it. You're not going to blame anyone, are you, for putting 2 and 2 together here and saying he's obviously done this because the guy's leading a pretty effective investigation into his campaign?
Well, I certainly don't think you can read into President Trump's mind. And I think that Trump really wants this investigation to be concluded. I don't think he's trying to thwart it. I think he wants to get it behind him because it's a real handicap to his presidency. So I don't think it's really logical to think that that was the goal behind his actions.
Don't you agree it should be pretty difficult for a president? President has the power to sack the director of the FBI. Don't you think it would be desirable if presidents used that with restraint and they treated it as something fairly difficult to do, maybe thinking about it for a while and having consultations or inquiries?
The sound, actually, I can't quite hear you. It's gotten a little bit rough.
Oh, I was just saying it should be very difficult to sack the director of the FBI, shouldn't it? Not too easy for a president to do that.
Well, I mean, presidents obviously can have anybody they want as the director of FBI. I mean, it's his decision. And I think initially, I don't think he was praising Comey initially. I think he wanted to give him a chance. And when he's face to face with somebody, he has a reputation for getting along with people and getting along with everybody and trying to be friends with people. And in order to oftentimes get them to do what he wants them to do and build relationships. So I don't think that's unusual at all. And it's obviously President Trump's choice. And I think that he very likely has a pure heart in this. I can't read into his mind just like Mr. Blumenthal can't, but that's what I believe.
OK, well, we'll leave it there. Thank you both. Charlotte Laws, Sidney Blumenthal, thank you both very much. One potential threat hanging over the Conservative election campaign was that of possible prosecutions for breaches of election law in 2014 and 2015. This is all to do with the party spending national money on local campaigns and counting it in the wrong box in order to override rules about how much can be spent. Well, today that threat almost went away. 15 police forces looking at multiple constituencies reported to the Crown Prosecution Service, and in 14 of those, no further action is to be taken. However, it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card for the Tory campaign. In one prominent case, a decision is still to come. Chris Cook reports.
The Conservative Party has already been in trouble over its election expenses from 2015. Tory HQ has paid a £70,000 fine for misreported spending in dozens of constituencies, the result of an exhaustive Channel 4 news investigation. But that fine may be it. The Crown Prosecution Service said today that it was now only considering criminal charges relating to overspending at the election in one constituency.
There was an error made in our national return for the 2015 general election. That was, and the Electoral Commission fined us for that, and we have paid that fine.
The cases dropped today relate to a battle bus campaign, which took Tory activists and shipped them into target seats. Now, what these cases actually really demonstrate is a real oddity in our election law. Specifically, there would have been no investigation at all and no problems at all had those Tory activists simply handed out leaflets that only mentioned David Cameron and the Conservative Party at large. The problem was that, and I quote the Electoral Commission, they found social media posts where activists from the coaches were holding campaign material promoting individual candidates. The reason they drew that distinction is that our law distinguishes between national spending, promoting parties, and local election spending, promoting candidates. Take two activists for a party who both want their man, Joe Bloggs, to win in Poppleton North. Let's say both get on a bus paid for by the party on the same day at the same cost, and both go leafleting to help Mr. Bloggs. Let's say, by the luck of the draw, one of them gets a bundle of leaflets that praise local man Joe Bloggs, and the other gets leaflets that only mention the party leader and national policies. The activist delivering the local Joe Bloggs leaflet will count as local spending, but the activist delivering the national leaflet will count as national or party spending. Never mind the fact that a vote for the national party in this seat would be a vote for Joe Bloggs.
In Victorian times, an MP was simply returned for his constituency without regard to any party label whatsoever. And the parties were not creatures really recognised by the law. They were certainly not controlled by the law. More recently, that is to say within the last 20 years, we've had a system which has recognised political parties and sought to control party expenditure. Hence, we've got one system left over from Victorian times for individual MPs and one system recently introduced for national expenses, for national campaigns, for now recognised political parties.
The case whose fate is yet to be decided, though, South Thanet in Kent, is the most serious. And it's not about activists handing out the wrong leaflets. It's about one party using its spending superiority to overwhelm another one. It's precisely the sort of activity that these rules are supposed to prevent. This case is also high profile because Nick Timothy, now the Prime Minister's co-chief of staff, ran that campaign. The CPS might not prosecute, though, for the same reason they declined to prosecute the other cases. They have to prove the local MP or agent broke their spending limits deliberately, not by accident, because Tory Central Office gave candidates duff advice about receipts. The law draws quite odd lines, and prosecution is difficult.
Chris Cook reporting there. Newsnight now, and in the run-up to the election, we've been devoting this spot to provocative ideas for the party manifestos, should they be minded to look for some. Well, tonight, Faiza Shaheen, director of the think tank Class, talks about property ownership.
It's time to restrict UK housing to UK taxpayers. People in the UK are angry about housing, and they should be. It's in crisis. By 2020, first-time buyers will need to be earning over £60,000 a year. In London, average earners now spend over 2/3 of their income on rent. The problem is as much to do with inequality and the rise of the global super-rich as it is to do with house building. Houses are being used as piggy banks for the world's super-rich. Foreign investors now own close to 10% of the UK's housing stock. In prime central London, 28% of the buyers don't even live in the UK. With a limited supply of housing, there is less to go around for the rest of us, pulling up house prices and rents at every level so that those at the bottom, young people and those on low incomes, have nowhere to go. But this isn't just a London thing. New developments in Manchester and Birmingham are increasingly advertised as investments for buyers overseas. We need to limit home ownership to UK residents. Only those that have been paying taxes in this country for 2 years, as well as the public sector, legitimate charities and companies domiciled in the UK, should be able to buy residential property. This would help ease our chronic housing shortage and stop the global super-rich from distorting our housing market. Countries like Switzerland, Australia and Denmark already have limits on where overseas buyers can invest. Why can't we?
Faiza Shaheen of the think tank Class. Noam Chomsky is not just one of the world's most famous academics. His work on linguistics has shaped the field in the modern era. He's also one of the world's most famous supporters of the political left. He's been at the University of Reading this evening, giving a lecture on the state of Western democracy. Now imagine it from his point of view. He's 88, he's campaigned for socialism for decades, against the grain of his fellow Americans. And just as rage at social injustice erupts and there's an overthrow of establishment thinking, he finds it's President Trump in office. For him, exactly the wrong kind of anger. Well, I went over to Reading this afternoon to talk to him about everything that is going on. And I asked what it was about Donald Trump that appealed to American voters.
What is the alternative? The Democrats gave up on the working class 40 years ago. It's just the working class is not their constituency. No one is their. No one in the political system is. The Republicans claim to be, but they're basically their class enemy. However, they can appeal to people on the basis of claims about religion, white supremacy.
So you think there was quite a racist motivation?
There's no doubt about that. By
What
now, there's a lot
are we talking 3% of the voters, 30%? Or
percent you can argue about,
but roughly,
it's a substantial streak. Fundamentalist religion is a substantial streak. Trump took an enormous quantity of the Christian fundamentalists, who are a big segment of the U.S. population. Remember, in the United States, about maybe 40% of the population think the second coming is going to be in their lifetimes. 2/3 think it's coming sooner or later. The United States is off the spectrum in this respect.
Do you think Trump will do much damage while he's there? And will it be permanent damage to the institutions of the US? Or do you think he'll be temporary phase?
The main damage he'll do is to the world, and it's already happening. The most significant aspect of the Trump election, and it's not just Trump, it's the whole Republican Party, is their departing from the rest of the world on climate change.
You've called the Republican Party the most dangerous organization on earth.
In human history. There has never, it's an outrageous statement, and when I said it, I said, look, this is a very outrageous statement, but is it true?
But you're rating them worse than the Kim Jong-un of North Korea or ISIS, who are very...
Is ISIS dedicated to trying to destroy the prospects for organized human existence?
Right, is that bad, the Republican
What
Party?
does it mean to say, not only we're not doing anything about climate change, but we're trying to accelerate the race to the precipice?
And you don't entertain the possibility that they may be genuine in their belief that this is...
Doesn't matter whether they genuinely believe it or not. But if the consequence of that is, let's use more fossil fuels, let's refuse to subsidize developing countries, if that's the consequence, that's extremely dangerous.
Macron won the French election, Emmanuel Macron, an internationalist, liberal, loves the EU, all the things in a way that the Trump voters have tried to reject. Do you think he can succeed? Is this the end of populism in Europe?
By no means. In fact, Macron is a good example of how the core institutions have collapsed. He came from the outside.
Yeah.
Okay. And the vote for him was substantially a vote against Le Pen, who is recognized correctly, I think, to be a serious danger.
What about the British election? Jeremy Corbyn has been leading the Labour Party. They have an uphill task, according to the opinion polls. Have you any advice, any thoughts about how Labour refines its pitch and makes it to government in the UK?
They should ask me to vote. I would vote for him. I mean, you know, they have a problem. I think he's a very decent, good person. I've followed his career for some years. He's not, evidently not inspiring the population. How Labour could, Labour has not come out with its program, so we don't really know what it'll be.
But there's a sense of a lack of clarity about quite what he stands for.
That's right.
Which is odd, because he was someone who was more clear about what he stood for decades.
What's happened to the Labour Party over the last, through the neoliberal years. It became, as many call it, Thatcher Light, especially under Blair. It did not represent the working class.
I want to talk to you about Julian Assange. You've been a big supporter of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and many progressive people have looked at WikiLeaks and said this organisation is on the wrong side of history. I just wonder whether you still believe in Julian Assange, despite the fact that they've published emails of Hillary Clinton stolen.
I believe that he should, that the persecution of him is completely wrong. The threats against him are completely wrong. They should be withdrawn. He should be freed. He shouldn't have to be imprisoned. I visited.
Judicial process, though, yeah? I mean, he needs to be questioned about the accusations.
Pretty much a fraud.
Is it?
I think so. There's no reason why Swedish prosecutors can't interrogate him on the charge that they think they have. In fact, they've already begun to do so. What's keeping him in prison, and in fact
embassy,
is in prison,
is his desire to go in there. No one sent him there.
The threat that the United States will go after him. Same thing that's keeping Snowden in Russia.
And is he right to worry about that
Of
threat?
course he's right to worry about it. And it's the threat that's wrong. As to what WikiLeaks is deciding to release, you can have various opinions. By and large,
what's your opinion of leaking stolen emails, perfectly legitimate emails, just stolen and then put in the public domain?
If they'd asked me, I would have not been in favor of that. So I don't know how they decide what to leak and not, but leaking, the general idea of informing the public, informing citizens of what their representatives are doing and keeping from them, that's a good idea.
Noam Chomsky, thank you very much indeed. Noam Chomsky there, in all fairness, speaking before the Mirror leaked Labour's manifesto. You can see a longer version of that on the Newsnight YouTube page. And that's it for tonight. And if the election's been spoiling the vibe of your springtime, we leave you with a celebration of seasonal fertility, courtesy of filmmaker Jamie Scott. Now, Mr. Scott has a genius for filming flowers blooming in time-lapse, and his latest work took 3 years to make. Here's a small but pungent clipping. Good night.
Which makes us blessed and makes for stormy weather. Days dawning, skins crawling. Days dawning.